Welcome to Cwic Show. My name is Greg Matsen, and I am your host. In this episode, I interview Jeff Strong, who is the author of the recent released book, Torn: Why People We Love Are Leaving the Church and What We Can Learn from Them. This is an interesting book. It has a certain approach. Some people like it and some people don't. And there are two different camps that are developing on this because it's a very successful selling book. Right now, I think it was number one in Latter-day Saints on Amazon. So people take an opinion on this. Jeff has an approach that is different than what I would give, for example. But I've had good conversations with Jeff, really good conversations with Jeff. I just don't agree with certain things. When I really look at this, it comes down to so many, it comes down to one thing that is brought up so many times that it seems to whittle down to this one issue, and that is love. And what is that? What does that mean? Because I think it means something different to different people. And I just had this discussion with Kurt Frankum just recently. I will say one thing for Jeff's book is this thing has got amazing packaging. This is incredible. I've already taken this book out a couple of times and repackaged it because of the way this box works. You can see his name here at the bottom. Forward by Steve Young. You open it up, and there at the top, you've got Steve with a little quote that he put in there. I've got a nice little note from Jeff. I've got the book, and then the bottom portion of the packaging has got a little outline of the book. Love this. This is great. And then he also sends in here an additional print piece, and this is one thing I want to cover. Going through this, he puts in 4 different questions here that are relevant to our interview here today. One is, how many are leaving? And he and I are very aligned with this. In our perspective, it's much higher than people realize. His numbers show about what I would say, and I think it's right. It's in the last, I think it's 25 years, about 40%. It's actually probably higher, have left the church. Active members of the church have left the church. The next question is why, and this is where we're going to disagree a little bit. It's the 4 primary reasons for disaffiliation. And you'll see in the interview that we've got a discussion on this. I just think that the issues are much deeper than the church itself. His focus in this book is on the church, and that's fine. It's just when you ask why, I believe that the issues are much deeper. They are cultural, they are philosophical. There's a certain soil in the U.S. right now, a secular soil, that is leading people to certain questions and to look at things differently. The next one is, are we centered in Christ? I think that we overlap in this quite a bit. And lastly, is our culture healthy? And I think we agree on this also. There are some issues with our culture that we need to address, and he talks about that. So I like that portion of the book. I also really like how he talks about those that have left. I also really like his perspective on the pain that people feel, those that leave the church, and of course the family and loved ones who have someone who leaves the church, and addressing that. I think that needs to be talked about. A lot of people are uncomfortable talking about their own family. And if you're in the church, you're uncomfortable talking about a child that may have left. So this gives an opportunity to read about this and address this. He has a different approach than I would have. If you've followed this podcast, you know how I feel about a teddy bear Jesus. And he, I believe, is a lot more on that side. And what I mean by that is not the amount of love, but maybe how we define love. But the discussion is important because a lot of people are suffering, those that have left and those that are still in the church. They suffer when their loved one leaves. And there needs to be an articulation about this. So you'll see in the interview, I agree on a number of things, but I disagree on others and push back on a few of the sections in his book. This episode is brought to you by Go and Do Travel and the Alaskan Frontier trip coming this September 5th through September 12th. This trip will be with myself and my wife and Steve and Elaine Dalton. We'll have presentations, we'll have time to talk, and we'll be in a beautiful part of the world. We'll embark from Seattle and we'll be in Sitka, in Juneau, Icy Strait Point, Ketchikan, Victoria, British Columbia, and then of course arriving back in Seattle. If this has been on your list to do an Alaskan trip, or if you've gone before and it was amazing to you, which it probably was, and you want to do it again, this is a great opportunity. And I would love to spend time with you. to be with people that are like-minded and are enjoying the beauty of the trip. To find out more or to register, go to cwicmedia.com, CWICmedia.com, go up to trips and events and scroll down to Alaskan Frontier. Here we go with Jeff. So Jeff, based on all your research, your team working on this research, why are people leaving the church?
Yeah, Greg, the short answer that I convey in the book is there are 4 reasons. So lifestyle, about 6%, church history, about 43%, social issues, and we can get into what those mean, 33%, and then church experience, 18%. And so that's what people cite as their primary reason for leaving, but I think it's more complicated than that, right? And so every person's decision is personal, unique, and complicated. There are certainly societal factors that are the playing field on which that happens is heavily influenced by what's going on around us in society. And then as you know, because you've read the book, I argue that there's a cultural component that kind of crashes over the top of those other 4 factors, and it can either alleviate the tensions or make them worse. And so that's how I would answer that question.
Can you go through how the research was done?
Yeah.
Is this a checklist? Is this write down your reasons?
Yeah.
How did you gather all this information?
Yeah. Do you want me to speak to methodology first?
Just go to methodology first.
Yeah. So we've got a little bit of time, so I'm going to give you the best answer I've ever given anybody.
Okay.
That's okay.
Excellent.
So when you've got a question like this, you start with, how could I get the best possible answer that would give us the most accurate view of how many are leaving and why, right? So a research expert, I've got plenty on my team, they would say, well, you would want to do a probability sample, right? A true representative sample of the entire Latter-day Saint population in the United States. And that would allow you to very predictably and accurately generalize to the total U.S. population. The problem is it's just not possible to do that. If you spent several $1 million, you could probably pull it off, but even the church wouldn't attempt to do a probability sample on this question. So that sort of leaves you with, okay, it's impractical and maybe impossible to do a true probability sample. Right now, we just have opinion and anecdote, right? So somewhere between those 2 useless extremes, we need to find a middle ground that is reasonable. And so what we chose to do is a non-probability sample. And so for the stat nerds that are out there, and I love those guys, they're my friends, we did what was called a stratified convenience sample. Now, what that means is we targeted representation. So we tried to get demographically and in terms of belief spectrum, everybody from hardcore out to really devout and everybody in between. And then as we did the work, we were checking to see, are we getting close in terms of these profile metrics that might help us understand we've got a reliable sample. None of my team would use representative. That would be incorrect. None of us would say you can generalize the findings to the total Latter-day Saint community in the United States. That would be incorrect. But what we would say is we think the data is reliable, right? So you do a non-probability sample, and so that's what we did. Now, specifically, we used 3 email databases: Scripture Central, huge database; Pretty Devout Orthodox Traditional Latter-day Saints; Faith Matters, another big database, more nuanced; and then Leading Saints, which is Orthodox and traditional, but with more of a leadership orientation. So we got massive email databases, sent the survey out that way. And then we also targeted social media, Facebook, Reddit groups, across the full spectrum, right? And so that's how you would do a stratified convenience sample, is you attempt to get representation. You never get there. You don't claim you do. You just try to get as close as you can. We wanted 3,000 respondents in order to feel like we've got a data set that's not representative, but it's robust, right? We can't make generalized claims, but we can learn a lot. And so here's what was interesting about the process. We sent the survey out. It was a combination of multiple choice questions and open-ended questions. And I'll get into that a little bit. We wanted 3,000 respondents. We got 15,000, right? And it was interesting to watch it take off. And I think what that taught us really early on is this is a really important subject for people, and they wanted to talk about it, right? So we didn't have to coax. We didn't incent anybody. Sometimes you might say, well, I'll give you $5 if you'll complete my survey. We didn't do any of that. And so people took it in droves. So just pausing for a sec, there are two things that any listener should be cautious about. Number one is it's not generalizable to the Latter-day Saint population. So we see it as incredibly useful, reliable learning, but not precise population estimates. Number two, it was opt-in. So people got to choose whether they took it or not. And the profile of people that opt in on surveys isn't exactly the same as the profile in the general community. So that's another limitation of the study. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So based on the email lists that you outlined, this is primarily then active members of the church?
We actually targeted former members and inactive members.
On those email lists?
No. On the email list, yes, that's correct. Thank you. That would be correct. Like Faith Matters, for example, of the people on Faith Matters email list that took the survey, 88% of them identified as being active, 12% not.
Okay.
Right. Now, where we got lots of former members or inactive members was through social media.
Social medias, yeah. But would you say overall then that it heavily skews to active members of the church?
It does a little bit, but not too bad. So we had good data sets on what the proportion should look like if we were roughly approximating what's accurate in the United States. And we got close, but there were two areas where our sample was a little overweighted. Slightly more women, and that's consistent with the social media placement, and then slightly more devout, but not extremely more devout, right?
Okay.
Yeah.
So on the questions, open end or multiple choice, what were the questions that specifically tried to zero in on why does somebody leave the church?
Let me talk how many first, because that's well. Actually, I'll answer your question, and then let's hop to how many. So we asked the question two different ways, right? And it's because different questions will elicit different kinds of answers. And I probably should pause and say, really good research is always preceded by lots of qualitative research, right? So you don't just sit down and design a survey. If you do that, your questions aren't going to be very good, right? Because you're not in touch enough with the subject population that you're trying to learn from. And so I did massive qualitative research over many, many years. I did it through friends and family when I was a bishop. Then I actually worked for the church for several years, and I did work with them that allowed me to get deeply into the qualitative space. Then I was a mission president for 3 years. Now, technically, I wasn't a researcher, but Greg, I was paying attention, right? So I had 700, Sarah and I had 700 missionaries over 3 years, a little over 700. This is typical for mission presidents, but I did 4,300 interviews. I read 50,000 pages of missionary weekly letters, right? And I did over 300 missionary meetings. Man, I paid attention. I was listening, I was watching, particularly the interviews where you're actually having really personal conversations with people about how they think about faith and belief in the church. So when I got home from my mission and decided to do this research, I was really, really deeply immersed in the qualitative learning. So it was super easy for me to work with my team to put together a high quality questionnaire. In fact, funny, I don't think Sam would have a problem with me mentioning this, but Sam Hardy is a professor at BYU, professor of clinical psychology. And one of his students saw the survey on social media and flipped it to Sam. And Sam took the survey and immediately called me and he said, I just need to talk to you. You obviously know what you're doing. Right. And so I ended up recruiting Sam, didn't take much, to be on my advisory board. And so Sam's probably the most published academic in the country on religious disaffiliation. And so he was super interested in what we were doing, right? And he continues to be. So we asked the questions two ways, multiple choice and open-ended. Now, the multiple choice questions, having done so much qualitative, I had a pretty good idea there were going to be four primary buckets, right? So church experience, lifestyle, church history, social issues, church experience. So I gave people those 4 options and I forced them to choose the primary one. But I gave them a 5th option, none of the above. Okay, and the first several hundred responses that came in, I was monitoring that, because if what you see is a big spike in none of the above, then you know your 4 choices are too limiting. We just didn't see any spike. People were content with those choices. So they'd select one of those reasons as their primary reason, and then I allowed them to type additional information if they wanted to share it, right? So we got the multiple choice answers plus some verbatims that were pretty rich. So that was the first way we did it. And, we should probably get into it a little bit. Even in those 4 choices, there's going to be some response bias that we should be transparent about. So I can come back and talk about that. The more interesting thing to me is we just asked people, why did you leave? And we just let them type whatever they wanted, right? And so some people wrote a blurb, like some people just said, Joseph Smith church history. That's it. Some people wrote sentences, some paragraphs, some people wrote pages. So when the dust settled, we had over 10,000 pages of verbatim comments. And it was so many that, like, I've done research in my career for years. I was an executive, not a researcher, but people did research for me, and then I read it, right? You can't read 10,000 pages and make sense out of it. So we actually had to develop a new AI app to actually query that data set to get the patterns, to get the insights. And we did that. And so, by the way, we're just scratching the surface. There's so much more work we could do with that 10,000 page data set. And so we got 2 different perspectives, right? We got a nice, clean, easy to talk about data set of 4 primary reasons. And then we got all these verbatims that give us really deep insight into what people experience personally.
Did you find any correlation between those that were Orthodox active members of the church and what they're saying? Because are you asking, did you leave the church, or why did you leave the church to be an Orthodox member of the church, active member of the church, as compared to others that may have left the church or were thinking of leaving the church? And what are the, again, I go back to what type of input would an Orthodox active member of the church give? Are they giving secondhand information from family members, or?
The questions I just discussed were, please tell us why you left the church, right? And so there are Orthodox members that leave, right? And they might leave. My experience in doing interviews is they might leave because they think the church has gotten too progressive, or they might leave because they didn't like the way that the church handled COVID or vaccines or things like that. And so we didn't separate people based on that profile when we asked them the question. We just asked them the question. We did, however, ask people, why do you think people leave? Right? And that way it allowed everybody to offer their perspective on what they think the reasons are for other people. That was really interesting.
How did that correlate with those that had left who answered why they left?
This is fascinating. And I offer this with some humility, right? So this is one of those areas where you'd say, okay, the data we got is useful for learning. We probably shouldn't project it with precision to the total Latter-day Saint population because it might not be accurate. The fascinating thing is the more devout a person was, the less likely they were to be able to identify the reasons most commonly cited by those who leave. Isn't that interesting? And I gave them a list. So what I also gave them,
there's a gap of understanding.
It is, right? And so it would be fascinating to talk about why that gap exists. And I've got a perspective. But we asked them, what percent of young adults under age 39 do you think step away from the church? And then what are the reasons, right? And in both cases, more devout members were less able to select the correct numerical answer, and they often picked the wrong reasons. Now, I don't know, you're a smart guy and you're very deep in the space. Why do you think a more devout, faithful member might have a harder time nailing the right answers there?
I think it's probably because they haven't gone through the same struggles.
I think that's really insightful.
They haven't gone through the same doubts.
Yes.
It may be more black and white to them.
I agree.
And so it's not only a gap of understanding, there's probably, unfortunately, the result of that is probably a gap in empathy.
I agree
on that. And then you get into a position where you say, okay, well, if you can't understand it, then the problem must be X, Y, Z.
Yeah.
and I need to fix it.
Yes.
How do I fix this?
Yes.
Right.
So I was actually in a priesthood quorum meeting in my home ward. And but let me start by saying this. I feel a lot of compassion and grace for people that get those answers wrong, right? Because I think it like for me, it's easy because I've been pulled so hard into this space, right? I mean, I have friends, family members, a member of my bishopric in Midway stepped away from the church when we were serving our mission. So I've been yanked into the space, right? But not everybody has. And if you haven't experienced it in your friends or your family, it's really easy to just not really be connected to the issue.
That's becoming less and less frequent.
Less and less frequent. Yeah. So I offer this with a lot of respect and humility to people that just haven't been sort of initiated into the space yet. But I had a man in my ward that I love tremendously. He's a good man. He's been a mission president like me. And he took the whiteboard marker, the marker in the whiteboard one day and explained why people left. And I'm watching him do that. I'm just going, yeah, no, that's not why. I didn't say anything. I could have corrected him, but I that wouldn't have been the right thing to do. So I just listened, and it was illustrative of the issue. I have this great quote in the book that I love. Winston Churchill was speaking of a political contemporary, and he said, sometimes he stumbles across the truth and he dusts himself up and moves along like nothing happened, right? And I people get locked into a perspective and they get very comfortable with that, and it's working for them, and that creates a blind spot. So we have a bit of a blind spot in our church on this issue, less so than in the past, but it's still there.
If I were to take your survey,
yeah,
and give it to the Baptists,
yeah, I know where you're going. Keep going. This is good.
And give it to the Methodists,
yeah,
and give it to the Catholics,
yeah,
and the Orthodox, what's the result going to be?
It's going to be really similar.
Yeah,
really similar.
So here's what this brings me to, and I think about this. I think that the book is fantastic. Everybody should read this book. Especially if you are either experiencing a faith crisis, or you have someone in your family experiencing or has experienced a faith crisis, has left the church. Very important stuff in here. But my question is, what were the 4 reasons you gave? The 4 points?
Number 1 is lifestyle.
Okay.
And that's the one we most commonly talk about, right? Yeah. The bumper sticker version of that is they just didn't have the faith and character to cut it. So they kind of washed out. Then church history is big, 42%. Social issues, which we should talk about, 33%. And then church experience, which is, man, it doesn't feel nourishing. It doesn't feel Christ-centered to me. It feels too institutional, too performative, 18%.
Okay, so if I go through with the other denominations in Christianity, we do a little bit of a better job, right, than most. We do, in some cases, the best.
Yeah.
In terms of retention, in terms of growth.
Yes.
Right. But we're in the exact same trajectory.
We are.
As the rest of Christianity.
We are.
And so your 42% on church history.
Yeah.
Is the number one reason of the 4.
Yeah.
What is the number one reason for a Baptist thing?
Yeah,
I mean, you got almost half under that category.
Are you thinking the composition might be a little different? Because I think it is. I think the categories might be similar, but the weighting might be different.
Yeah, a Baptist, what are they going to say about church history?
Yeah.
I mean, they might be go back and saying, I think the Catholics had it right. There's not much more than that's going to be an issue in there. There could be some race issues, I suppose, and things like that. But my point is that I think that within the church, I think these numbers are important and should be understood really well. However, in the U.S., there is something else happening that has nothing to do with the church.
Yeah, there is, for sure.
It has to do with Christianity. It has to do with religion.
Yes.
And when you're seeing the even worse numbers elsewhere.
Yeah.
And it's not, Joseph Smith married a 14-year-old or something, it's like, well, wait a minute. This is a much broader issue that may not fit perfectly into these 4 categories. Some of them maybe lifestyle, right?
I tell you, social issues, dead fit.
Yeah.
Lifestyle, church experience, church history less so, Yeah, and I can talk that, but yeah, I think what you're saying is right on the money.
Yeah. So my point on this is to me, I look at it and I think, well, wait a minute, there are cultural issues that are changing people inside and outside of the church.
Yeah.
And I believe in a way that is creating a new world view, very secular view.
Yeah.
That people are going through the same pain and families are going through the same pain that are not Latter-day Saints.
Yeah.
That are going through this because there is, number one, it's the internet.
For sure.
Just purely. I mean, if you go back into the late 90s and the 2000s, this is the generation of John DeLynn.
Yeah.
Right? Where early on, this is my generation.
Yeah.
Where you start reading these things, you're an early adopter onto information online, and you start struggling with, well, wait a minute here. I didn't know this. I didn't know that. And that's not right. And those seeds of doubt start coming in.
For sure.
A lot of those people come back.
Yeah.
At this point.
Yeah.
So I still think more will. But that's one big reason I think you can look at.
Yeah.
And secondly, you can look at social media silos that we all start putting ourselves into.
Yeah, we get very tribal.
Very tribal and honestly, shame and peer pressure and et cetera. That's going to persuade individuals that will say, well, this is just easier not to go with this.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right?
I told my wife like 10 years ago, I said, I think we're coming to a tipping point. Okay. And she said, what do you mean? I said, well, I just feel it. I mean, I'm in these circles, I'm talking to people, and the tipping point will kind of be triggered when it becomes more socially acceptable to leave. Right. And I think we hit that. And so that created, I talk a little bit in the book about an acceleration of disaffiliation. And I want to be really clear. I'm probably going to amend that because I think the degree of acceleration I cited is probably too high. But there is an acceleration, and I think that part of that is that it became more socially acceptable to step away than it used to be. I mean, growing up, Greg, I don't know about you, but like I can't remember anybody leaving the church in my home area, right? And if they did, it was like a massive scarlet letter.
Yeah,
and now it's more socially acceptable to do that.
Well, based on the numbers, I mean, going back to my generation and early on, when I was a teenager, when I was in my early 20s, you saw about a 25%, a 75% retention rate.
Yeah.
In the U.S.
Yes.
Now, at Christianity broadly, I mean, you're lucky to be at 40%.
That's right. It's about half that.
So it's the change has been massive.
Yeah.
In because let's say we started at a point in somewhere in the mid to late 70s, but if you started in 1980, you look at 45 years, 50 years maybe total.
Yeah.
It's a massive influence of secularization
for sure
that has changed the framework of someone's trajectory and vision of their identity, their purpose. The way they're going to love, honestly, in terms of sacrifice and investment.
Yeah. There's one stat that I cite in the book. It's not from my research. I think it's from Pew. But, so you talked about this disruptive nature of the internet, no question. A massive loss in institutional trust is happening as well. And so it's not just it's religious institutions, but it's also academia, it's also business, and it's certainly politics, right? And so I cite a statistic in the book where among younger people, the percent of them that do not trust institutions has doubled in like the last 10 years. And it's a big number. It's like 44%, right? So think about that. I have my son, Cale, who you read about in the book. He's 32. And I grew up in an era like you did where institutions were revered, right? Political leaders were really, really much more generally, I mean, there were exceptions for sure, but they were generally thought to be of high character. Academia was like bulletproof, right? And even there was some ethical sort of framing around business that seems different than what it is today. Yes. And so I grew up with a mindset of institutions are vital to be trusted, essential to society. And I still feel that way, right? But if you ask my 32-year-old son, he's a huge skeptic. And so he's probably typical of people his age, right?
Can I ask you a question on this?
Yeah, please.
Do you think that, because that brings up, I think, two levels on this, because the lack of institutional trust.
Yeah.
In some ways, you've got to say, yeah.
Yeah, some of it's deserved, for sure.
Some of it's deserved,
Yes.
right? You've got an internet again with everybody knows everything, and transparency
Instant,
changes,
real time.
and so every little problem, all of a sudden,
Bam, it's right there.
the voices are higher than they would be if everything's going normal, as is human nature.
Yeah, and by the way, AI is going to multiply that 100
Yeah,
times,
absolutely.
you know?
What I'm getting to is what I think is a little bit more of a fundamental idea.
Yeah.
Faith.
No, yeah, I'm
Right, where it's whether it's the church or it's directly a relationship with God, also an authoritative figure.
Yeah.
You know, it just seems like the overall level of faith to me is trust, right?
Yeah.
So if I'm lowering trust in all things, I'm lowering my faith in all of these things,
Yes.
including the church, including the gospel, including my relationship with God.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll tell you, yes, I agree with that. And then here's where, to me, it gets really problematic. So let me speak specifically to church things. If we're in any way guilty of giving people a caricature of the gospel, we're in dangerous territory, right? Like the gospel, the real gospel, eternal doctrine, eternal truth, truth and light, I believe is, the term I would use is it's all weather, right? It can handle, if your roots are deeply into the doctrines and the truth of the gospel, and you've been able to translate that into your lived experience, you don't care that much what people are saying on the internet, right? And you don't care as much about, Fanny Alger, because there's something else that you're rooted in, which is the transformative power of the gospel in your life, which you've experienced, right? But man, the minute we turn the gospel into a caricature and we start pushing that, particularly towards young people, then they get rooted in something else that's not the gospel. It's tradition, it's culture, and then they're very, very vulnerable to all these factors that are swirling around us.
I'm glad you brought that up. I had a very good friend of mine that Kurt Frakum.
Yeah, Kurt.
He was sitting right in your chair here about 3 hours ago, and that was the discussion that I had with him.
Yeah.
I wanted to talk about doctrine.
Yeah.
And the why behind it, right? And
Yes.
and the anchoring of this, because to me, I see an erosion of these, and we talked, what is doctrine, what's not doctrine, other things. Okay, fine, but the erosion of these eternal truths,
It's problematic.
and not just the erosion of them, but an understanding of them, and I think that I'd like to know your thoughts on this based on all this research that you've done. But to me, I see that there is, number one, a lack of actual doctrine that is being taught.
Yeah.
And I mean that very core. What is the atonement? What is the plan of salvation?
Yeah, just the doctrine of Christ.
The doctrine of Christ. And then why?
Yeah. Yes.
And because we see this often in the relationships and that gap we're talking about when someone leaves the church in your family, for example. The tendency is to say, well, okay, we've got this area of judgment here that we're looking toward. And if my son, my daughter, my spouse, whoever it is, doesn't change, what's going to happen over here? Because I want this up here.
Yeah.
And if they don't want that, what's going to happen? And so we focus in on this judgment side, and we better fix this right away, right? And so this is and we've been this way as a church.
Yeah.
In the
part
past,
of the culture.
right? It's part of the culture, and we've focused in on that a lot. The other side, which I think we're moving actually more to this side of the pendulum, is we just don't talk about that.
Yeah.
And you and I have talked about this before, but we end up with a teddy bear Jesus, and
we need to talk teddy bear a little bit.
yeah, and then we end up kind of with this all grace and all mercy, and God loves you no matter what, and He'll come to you where you are, and that's the gospel.
Yeah.
But to me, you have to marry these things.
You do. I couldn't agree more. So can I just share an insight that was instructive for Sarah and I on our mission, and then since we got home? So, one of the blessings and benefits of what our family went through when Cale left the church is it caused me to really, really step back, Rick. I mean, I stepped back so hard and I said, why didn't my map work? Like, it was going so great. And then all of a sudden there was no place on my, it's like I came to a raging river and there was no bridge. So I'm going, what in the heck do I do? How do I think about this? How do I think about my family? And so it was a several-year process, but part of what I learned through scripture study, prayer, reflection, talking to my son and other family members is too much of what I had based my beliefs and faith in was not the gospel. It wasn't the doctrines. Now, I'm a pretty doctrinally oriented guy, but I had strayed from that and I'd gotten a little too wrapped up in culture and tradition. And so there was a hard reset for me, 10 years ago, where I said, I really need to base my faith and my personal religious culture and the culture of people I can touch and influence in the core doctrines of the restored gospel, right? So I had that mindset shift, and you know what? It was great. And so the way I thought about the church and my faith changed, but my faith in God and in the Savior deepened considerably. And then we go on a mission, right? And I'm seeing the same patterns in my incredible, awesome young missionaries that were in my life. And I could see how, they've got a map, but it's primarily a map of the Latter-day Saint checklist, right? What do we need to do to be and be seen as good Latter-day Saints, right? So it was things like, follow the prophet, read your scriptures, go to your meetings. These are all important things. Make sure that you have, these were young people, so partial, use temple recommends, attend seminary, get your Young Woman in Excellence Award, right? These are all valuable things, but they're not the gospel, right? And then they would come on their missions and complexity and suffering would hit them, as is the case on missions, and they would lean on those things, and those things didn't save them, right? So Sarah and I spent most of our 3 years, you're running the mission, you're trying to find and teach and baptize converts, but the pastoral priority we had was to teach our missionaries the gospel. It sounds so silly, but if you go back and look at all of our zone conferences, we were trying to teach them discipleship. What does it mean to be a disciple of Jesus Christ and his church in 2019, 2020, and 2021, right? And it was such a great experience, right, to go through that journey with them. And so I think in as much as our culture and our beliefs and faith are rooted in those things, we're much less subject to be derailed by everything going on around us.
Do you think that, again, based on what, your personal experience and going through this research and writing this book, the tendency again is to, let's start with the pain.
Yeah.
Right? On both sides.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people need to understand.
It's the same pain.
It's the same pain.
It's the same pain.
I went on, I hope John's okay with me saying this, I think he is, but I went on John DeLynch's show earlier this year or late last year. And he gave me the chance at the end there to interview him.
Yeah.
And I'd gone to lunch with him, spent a couple hours with him. And, but I learned something I didn't really know before in speaking with him. And it's not that I agree with it. I don't, right? But I understood his process more and the pain that he felt.
When I watched that, when he compared his disruptive church history learning to, keep me honest here, but it was like he had learned that one of his parents were having an affair.
Yes.
And you could just feel that years later, it's been 20 years, he still is wounded by that.
He's still wounded by it.
Yeah. And I get it.
Yeah. And that is not something I understood before. I did not understand that pain that he had felt. I would say, John, hey, I think maybe there's some other options on this, but but I didn't understand that completely before. And I understand that a lot closer now and that he's wounded. He is by this, right? And others are wounded in a way that they feel betrayed.
Yes.
Or just massive loss of what they thought they had and what they were hoping to have in their life.
Yes.
because of a loss of belief, a loss of faith, etc. And so,
Well said.
and then there's his family members, right? He's got active family members that are like, okay, what's pain that you're going to feel up because he's now leaving the church, right? Or he's leaving his beliefs behind him.
Yeah.
And the pain that a parent or a sibling or a spouse or whoever it might be would feel because of that.
Yeah. And I'll tell you, just to make it really personal, like I've interviewed so many people, and I understand why we're where we are and how we got here. And yet my heart hopes for something better. But I've interviewed husbands and wives that divorced over this. I've interviewed parents who disown children over this. I've interviewed children who cut off parents over this. I've interviewed people whose friendships ended over this. And I get that, right? Because it's such a massive part of our mindset and what's in our hearts and minds that when that's no longer there, and it creates a whole host of side effects, it can end a relationship. But in my head, I'm going, gosh, I think God would want something better than that, right? There's got to be something more relational, more healing, where people don't have to adopt one another's views, right? I'm not suggesting that, but where they can offer some. I mean, you and John did a really nice job in that discussion. You disagree on most things, but you had an incredibly mature, thoughtful, respectful discussion. That's the spirit of what I think is possible for more of us.
Why you had the numbers of those 4 areas within the church of why individuals are leaving. Well, there's a larger portion of people leaving than people actually realize when you really dig down into the numbers.
Yeah.
Probably a lot more than people realize.
And by the way, some I've talked to other researchers. We rounded down to 40. Mm-hmm. Our data actually suggests something in the mid-40s. Pew would suggest about 46. The Harvard CES study, and I probably need to talk this a little bit. Through 2024, it was about 43. And I've talked to really capable researchers who have looked at this, and they think the 40% number's conservative, and that's fine. We wanted it to be, right? We're not trying to be provocative. But a good question is, okay, Jeff, your study says low to mid 40s, you rounded to 40. For your audience, for that number specifically, we did much more than just our study, right? Because it was such an important number. So we then went out and found the best world-class research that's available and calibrated, right? So the Pew studies peg it in the mid 40s, and that is a nationally representative probability sample. So any researcher will tell you the Pew study is the gold standard. It essentially gives us the same number. Harvard's is also thought to be incredibly reliable. There are a couple of issues with Harvard that you got to be a little bit careful with, but it pegs it in the same vicinity. There's a fourth one besides ours and the 2 I cited, the GSS or General Social Survey from the University of Chicago. Similar magnitude, right? Now it's smaller base size, so you got to be really careful with it.
Yeah, no, there's the PRRI.
That's it.
Oh, that's it. Yeah, that's it. I thought that was in the 30s actually, but
yeah, and I think I don't quote me on this, but it's I think 38's the number that's sticking in my head. So when 4 different studies all land in approximately the same place, and one of them is a gold standard probability study, it gives you a higher degree of confidence that you've got it right. Right. So we think that number is pretty sound. Now, the rest of my study, we didn't have the ability to calibrate everything. And so it falls back into that. Be careful about generalizing to the total population. The way you think about our insights and finding is really, really valuable for learning, but not precise estimates.
Yeah. So this is where I get criticized a little bit because I'm not, I like to say I'm not in the all is well in Zion camp.
I'm not either.
and a lot of people just want to be, and it's all needs to be positive. And it's like, I'm into awareness. I want awareness. You decide what you want to do with it. But I want awareness. And so, for example, we had in the last 2025 was an incredible year for the church in terms of conversions.
All-time record.
All-time record. I think it doubled almost from where it was previously the year before. Before that,
we had 389,025, 309,024, but 24 was the highest since 1997.
Yeah.
Right. So these last 2 years have been outliers from an overall negative trend.
Okay. So that's all fantastic.
Yeah.
But the church didn't grow.
No.
Yeah, well, I think it did. I think it was like 86 people. It was honestly that
about the Matt Martinich study.
Yeah. It was like 80 something people in growth total in the church.
Yeah.
And two other problems. If you've got that 40% plus that are leaving the church, and you've got a fertility rate that is dropping to the basement right now, you also go over and you look at the children of record.
Yeah, it's
dropping fast.
Yeah. And by the way, when I talk to people who are experts that work for the church, they don't tell me anything they're not supposed to. And I don't ask.
Yeah.
But that is the number that they probably lose the most sleep over.
Yeah. So you've got this great stuff happening up here. The missionary program seems to be doing fantastic.
Yeah, something very new and different is going on.
But again, I'm going to give the same example that I did before in terms of people leaving the church.
Yeah.
And that is that, well, the Catholics did great too. And the Protestants did great and the Orthodox did great. And there was a tick up in the last 18 months actually in Christianity, especially for males.
Yeah.
Right. And so that all came up. Again, I don't see that as a church-specific thing.
No.
And I want it to be. But it's not.
Well, as a mission president that, spent 3 years scratching and clawing for every single convert I could get, the 389,000 number just blows my mind.
Yeah.
It just literally blows my mind. Now, I also know, and I'm not speaking specifically to 2025, but in general, most converts don't stay. A majority of converts don't stay.
Right.
So that's why if you look at the member of record increase from 2000 to 2024, it was about 60% in the United States, but the number of congregation increase specific to wards was about 11%. Yeah. Okay, so there has to be an explanation for the difference, and largely it's disaffiliation, but birth rates and death rates also factor in.
Sure.
And so, you said something a minute ago. I want to go back to relative disaffiliation because that's what you're poking at a little bit here. So I got to tell you a funny story. So I lived in Cincinnati for 6 years, which is a predominantly Catholic community. I lived in the South for 9 years, which is predominantly evangelical. So I have tons of friends that are evangelical or Catholic. And one of them in particular, I spend a lot of time with, and he's super interested in this research, right? For the reasons you're kind of raising. And he's a buddy. So I talk and I whine sometimes. Bob, what about this? And so I was saying, we have these problematic issues in our history. 42% of people that left cite that as their primary reason. And I'm waxing on about that. And he just starts to laugh. And he's Catholic. And I said, what are you laughing at, man? And he says, Jeff, have you ever heard of the Spanish Inquisition? He started rattling off all of the massive historical problems in the Catholic Church, right? Yeah. And I think what I actually said to him, Greg, that triggered the comment is I said, I see a maturity in Catholicism that I don't quite see in my church yet. My church is, 200 years old. Catholicism is centuries old. So some of the issues that we're still trying to figure out, it seems like you guys have figured them out and put them to bed. And then I talked history, and that's when he laughed at me. And so I want to be clear, when people tell you why they leave, I think you got to respect it. You got to say, okay, if it was church history for you, and that was, as it was for John DeLynn, that was fatal. I don't want to start putting qualifiers on that, right? Because I think that can be seen as being disrespectful.
Sure.
But I don't think there's any church history issue I'm not aware of. Like, people that do forensic level research might surprise me with something, but in general, I know all the I know all the issues. But it's never really affected me because my conversion, that was not the keystone of my conversion, right? My conversion happened as a 19 and 20-year-old, and it was really my experience with the gospel in action in my life, right? The atonement, becoming a new creature in Christ, reading the scriptures, and then seeing the principles of the scriptures come alive in my life and going, wow, Mosiah chapter 5, a mighty change in our hearts so that we have no more disposition to do evil, but only to do good. Greg, that was me. I mean, I went from an 18-year-old that was, a little rebellious to a 19-year-old on a mission that all I wanted to do was do good. And then I read after that happened, Mosiah 5, and I went, oh my gosh, that is exactly the Spirit wrought that mighty change in me. So when I heard about, different problematic issues in church history, I would go, okay, well, that seems problematic, but it doesn't change what happened to me. Right.
Did you have any, sorry, Rick.
Yeah, no, that's it.
Did you have did you ever have a point in your life where you had gone through some doubts? I mean, we all doubt a little bit to some degree now with sure things, but did you have a period where you're like, well,
for me, I think it was apathy, not doubt. Mm-hmm. So I was raised in a faithful Latter-day Saint home. I have 7 siblings, and in our church, you went to church, right? So my dad was he's a good man, perfect father for me, but pretty authoritarian. And my mom, it was like iron-fisted dad, velvet glove mom, right? She was the disciple of Christ, gentle, kind. So I got both. I was very okay with church until I was a teenager. And then I played 3 sports and I had a cute girlfriend, And so I went to church as an obligation, but I was not living my faith with real intent. And the change point for me, if he's out there, I hope he calls me. So Brother Dancy, my home teaching companion. So he asked me, he's just a normal guy, and he just said, hey, you got to go on a mission. And he wasn't pressuring me, but I said, I was 18, and I said, I don't know if I am, right? I was never the person that was led by, I've never been a herd guy, right? I've always been a guy that I'm gonna do what I think is right. So I wasn't gonna serve just because that's what you did in Springville, Utah in 1981, right? And I said to him, I just don't want to do something like this if I don't really believe in it. And his response was really interesting. He said, well, of course you don't believe in it. I said, what do you mean? And he said, you don't live it. He said, you're a good kid, Jet, but you're just going through the motions. And he said, you should try it. And it really hit me. And so here's what I did. I started to read my scriptures instead of cutting seminary class, 7th period, so I could get to football practice early. I started to pray with real intent instead of just going through the motions. I started to pay my tithing. And then the most important thing I did is I tried to have a different mindset at school. So I was a little bit shy in high school, and I decided I'm going to really try to be kind to people. I go out of my way to be kind, right? To be nice to people, to be like Christ was. And you know what happened? I did all these things. I started to change, and I liked myself better. I had, the Spirit was much richer in my life. I had better sense of purpose, more clarity. And that mighty change was underway in me. And that was it, right? And then I went through a process, to put my papers in and go on a mission, and that just accelerated as a missionary. And so my conversion really is rooted in moving out of apathy into real intent, and then experiencing the fruits of that in my life. And that's always been the basis of my conversion. Okay. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I was asking that just to try and get a thermometer reading on when you had your experience with your son.
Yeah.
Is there anything you had gone through before that at that point, or?
Well, that was sort of another reawakening, because what happened after my mission, I had a brother, my older brother, Scott, he's 13 years older than me, and he left the church 25 years ago. And this goes back to your point on handling this stuff better, but he was a lot older than me, but I was his tiny little brother, right? So he just took care of me, right? He was on a mission in the Central States, and he sent me a Green Bay Packer football jersey that I think I wore for 3 years until it fell off my body in tatters. He taught me how to fish. He'd come to my football games, my baseball games, and I just loved him. And he stepped away around 2005-ish, and all of a sudden there was this huge gap, distance in our relationship, and I didn't understand it. Now while he's stepping back, I'm going through BYU. I'm in my business career. I was called to be a bishop. I've been in 5 bishoprics. The first time was at 27. So I'm sort of running the LDS playbook, and it's working well, and I'm being validated in the community and loved and embraced. And then it only accelerates, right? I end up teaching at BYU. I go on a mission as a mission president. And so he's sitting there having had a very different experience in the church, and he's just feeling like, I don't even know who my brother is. Like, how could he stay in the church if he knew what I know about church history, right? So we used to go fishing, and I would, during this distance period, I would say, hey, let's go. And he would say no, right? And it was sad for me, but I understood it. I just didn't know why. And then about 2 years ago, I was deep into this research. I tried again, let's go fishing. He said yes. So he flew to Utah. We got in a car, drove out to the Green River. It's like a 5-hour drive. And he just said, what are you up to? I told him about the research in the book. And we couldn't stop talking. So it was 6 hours out. We stayed up most of the night in the hotel, then talked all day fishing the next day and all the way back. And by the time we got back to Midway, the ice was gone. And what was interesting, he said to me, I just had a lot of misconceptions about who you were and what you thought, what you believed, how much you knew. And I, by the end of that conversation, we realized we have the same data set, he and I, but we've had a very different experience in the church and with the gospel. So we interpreted it differently, right? And it was nothing but respect. I looked at him and said, I understand why you did what you did. And he looked at me and said, I understand why you've done what you've done. And then he hit the punchline was, it's very clear to me that you understand the issues, but the church and the gospel has been a great blessing in your life. So you stay. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. And so that is background leading into Cale. I came home from my mission and I was converted to the gospel, but Greg, I kind of fell right back into the pattern of just running the playbook, right? I don't know how deeply intentional my beliefs were, and it worked, right? In my family, we read our scriptures, we had family prayer, family home evening, we had callings, we were serving, we were going to church, we tried to live Christ-like lives. But in hindsight, what I did is I taught my kids the church more than I taught them the gospel. I don't think I ever, for example, sat down with my family and said, I want to talk about the doctrine of Christ. And I want to talk about what it really is. I want to talk about what faith really is. I want to talk about what repentance really is. I want to talk about the Spirit and how it really works. I just kind of trotted out gospel principle, ensign, family home evening manual lessons, right? And so when Cale decided to step away, that was the tectonic plate shift, right? Because I just realized, he's not a kid anymore. He's 32. He's a full-grown man. He is such a good person. And I realized how could somebody like him that is so good and has such an appetite for what's true and good reject this? And you know what I learned? He rejected the caricature that I gave him. I don't want to overstate that. It's not like I gave him garbage, right? I gave him good stuff, but it was weighted towards culture and tradition, not towards truth and doctrine. And what I didn't do is I didn't sit down with him and have those deep conversations about, well, let's talk about this doctrine or this piece of truth and really try to deeply understand it. So fast forward when we go on a mission and my missionaries are coming in and they're giving me the playbook instead of the gospel, you better believe I was prepared to have very different conversations with them. Right.
Do you believe that, I'm going back to something we were talking about here just previously, but yeah, do you believe that then in this example that you just gave, that caricature of the church, the traditions, the culture, if there was a better discussion about the doctrine and an understanding of why the doctrine is there, that would be a preemptive move by us, by the church, by the brethren, by whoever else to say, okay, this is how you get rooted.
Yeah, without a doubt. Now, that's my opinion based on research and life experience, but I believe that deeply, deeply, deeply.
So, and I brought this up with Kurt too, but I'm going to repeat it anyway. What I've been thinking about a lot lately is the words of Jesus, which are, the Sabbath was created for man.
Yeah.
Not man for the Sabbath.
Yeah.
And to me, it's the same thing with the church. It's the church.
Yeah.
Right. The church was created for man, to help support man, to create individuals and families that can develop and grow and become more like God.
Absolutely.
But we flip it. Oftentimes.
Yes, we do.
And we create an idol of sorts.
Yeah.
That is the church.
Yeah.
And that's a very difficult, sensitive subject because, we've got a church you love. You've got the brethren that you uphold and revere. Songs like Follow the Prophet, and all of these different areas that are faithful and promoting of the gospel and of the church. But you can make the Sabbath for man if you're not careful.
Yeah. Yeah. It's funny because as part of my journey, I've more deeply studied the gospel in the New Testament, in the Book of Mormon, in the Doctrine and Covenants, and the teachings of Christ in the New Testament take on new meaning as your frame changes, right? You reinterpret, you have a deeper understanding. So to your point, the simple parable of Christ healing the blind man on the Sabbath, I just am fascinated by that parable. So the context is that there's a religious society there that's very rule-based, right? So the Pharisees and the Sanhedrin, it's very, the lawmakers, the religious lawmakers are in control of the culture. And so part of that was Sabbath observance, right? Part of that was purity culture, meaning, how you wash, how you eat, what you eat, the dishes that you use. And in the midst of that culture, Christ healed a blind man on the Sabbath with spit and dirt, right? And he was sending a message that it wasn't that those laws were unimportant, but there was a priority they were missing, right? The priority of a human life and restoring life as opposed to following rules. Now, I'm naturally a rule follower, but I think that might be what you're talking about, right? Is it's rules ordered to what? To themselves or to lifting and elevating human beings closer to God?
Yeah, I had a bishop once that Sunday morning.
Yeah.
He's my next door neighbor. And our pipe broke in our backyard.
Yeah.
And there's just water everywhere. And we get the water turned off, but there is water everywhere in our backyard. It's a foot deep in some places, 3-4 inches deep in other places. And it's coming up toward the house almost, and getting up over the berm of the house. And so the bishop sees that our water's running out front, down the side yard and running down in front. And he had come out to get to church with his family.
Right. He's probably not, he's not early.
He walks to the backyard, sees what's happening and says, I'll be right back.
Yeah.
And he sends his wife off with his kids to church, to sacrament meetings, where he's conducting.
Yeah.
And says, I'll get there when I get there.
Yeah.
And he helped us clean out the water.
Love it.
So that we didn't have any damage.
I love it. I love it. That's a bishop that has a really good sense of priority.
Yeah, exactly.
So super good insights. One thing you'd be interested in, I was having a conversation with a church official, it wasn't a general church leader, it was an executive for the church. And I don't remember it's been a year since this conversation happened, but he said, we were talking about church education and BYU, and I'm a BYU grad, so is my wife. 4 of my 5 kids are. I taught there, loved it. I thought it was sacred ground for me. And he said something that triggered me a little bit, that surprised me, because normally if I'm going to have a hard conversation, I prepare emotionally to be triggered so that I won't overreact. But I overreacted a little bit, and he was sort of taken back by it. And what I said to him was, I don't want my children and grandchildren to be protected at BYU. I want them to be prepared, right? You can't protect them, and the world is out there and it will find them. And so rather than have a mindset where we're trying to shield, protect, and bubble wrap our children, prepare them. Confront the issues, the secular issues you're talking about. understand them, confront them, and in a faith-based way, help our young people understand the merits of the gospel, the merits of the doctrine in the most challenging of circumstances they still hold, right? And I said, that's what I want for my grandchildren, right?
Yeah.
And so it's sort of a little bit of teddy bear Jesus, right? Teddy bear Jesus is protect. Non-teddy bear Jesus is no, don't protect, prepare, right? And so that's the spirit, I think, of what we're talking about here.
Now, you found in the research that it wasn't members necessarily just on the fringe
Yeah.
that were falling away from the church.
Mm.
You actually had strong families, fathers, mothers, that had built strong families inside the church, and that these individuals are leaving also.
Yes.
What is the reasoning behind that? Is that any different from anybody else, or are these matters just as do they reach everybody?
That's a really insightful question. I would say if you're talking about the difference between somebody that sort of fits the traditional profile of traditional family, deeply committed, really active.
How we get back up that?
Oh yeah, sure. Very likely had temple recommends, all of that. And somebody that was more casual in their participation. I think the difference in faith transition would be how much longer they try to make it work before they disengage, right? So the depth of their journey, the number of hours, the amount of energy, the searching they do. In terms of the reasons they cite, I'm not aware that they would be different. But let me give you a couple of examples of people I've interviewed that might fit your profile. So I know a woman who was a stake release society president in another state, not here in Utah, and she was about as devout as you could be, but she stepped away. And when you might agree or disagree with the reasons, but she has a bunch of daughters. And when she was called to be the stake release society president, the stake president handed her the list of counselors that she was going to have. And it's not just that one event. It was a pattern of feeling like, okay, I don't know if the voice of women is being valued enough. I don't want priesthood office, but I think the voice of women needs to be louder in the church and be heard. And I'm not sure I want to raise my daughters in an environment where that's not the case. Okay, now you can disagree with that. You know, and many do, but this was a deeply devoted woman who stepped away because she was concerned about the well-being of her daughters, right? Now, she's not leaving faith. She's not leaving belief. But she lost some faith in the church as an institution, as the custodian of faith. And so that was the basis. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah. I know others. Let me think. I'll think of another example. I know former stake and mission presidents who have stepped away, and it was their proximity to church leadership that was their undoing. So they didn't lose their faith, but by working a lot with
seeing a prophet in their own land.
That's it. Now, what my experience is I've been unbelievably inspired and occasionally disillusioned, right, by my exposure to very senior church leaders. The ones I know personally, I respect and love them more than anybody on the planet. I know Elder Bednar really well. Elder Kieran was my neighbor in Midway. They're as good as they could be, right? My experience with general authorities has mostly been really positive, but, they're human. And sometimes they make mistakes and do things that are, problematic. And so some people say, I believe in the restoration and I love the gospel, but it's hard for me to sustain church leaders as prophets, seers, and revelators when maybe they're not all that, right? And so those are the complexities that start to play in that sometimes will even cause devout people to step away. The biggest issue that I see is, and by the way, I think this varies a ton by ward, right? And by location in the country, but a really, really good Christ-centered bishop can solve most of these issues, right? And just because they lead and direct the ward to be very Christ-centered in its approach.
So I'm sorry, they can avoid these issues.
They can largely mitigate them. The issues being, let me be more precise. So if somebody's feeling tension in their church experience because they're saying, boy, the church just feels too institutional to me, And so it feels a bit performative. It's a little too checklisty. We spend more time talking about prophets and temples and checklists than we do the doctrines of Christ. I'm not feeling spiritually fed here. A really great bishop can fix that, generally. And then a bishop that has a different orientation might amplify it, right? Might make it worse. And so there's a lot of variability across the church community and by geography.
Yeah. What you talk a lot about this tension you just brought up, a tension between tradition and change.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that?
I think that church history is a good example. I think social issues are a good example. The world's different than it was 20 years ago, right? I mean, it was really the advent of the internet around 2000 where the church history issues started to get lots of visibility. By the way, that also corresponds with when the church started being a lot more transparent about the history. Things like the Joseph Smith papers, and then like 2013, the gospel topic essays, and then finally saints, right? And so that's new stuff that's come forward. Things like equality for women has been around for a really long time. I mean, I remember the whole New Era stuff that was happening in the 80s when I was in high school. But sexual identity stuff is relatively new. I'm not saying it hasn't been around a long time, but it hasn't been so intense and in the public consciousness until the last 10 or 15 years, right? And so that's the tension that change produces. And tradition can fight against those things, right? Now, I'm not, I've said publicly, there's nothing that I see in my research or my experience that suggests the doctrines of the church have to change. Now, there are people that are LGBTQ advocates that would disagree with me. They would say, look, you can't solve that just by being good Christian people. There has to be a policy change or a doctrinal change. That one's more complicated for me. But most of the rest of the stuff I see, if we were doing a better job handling the tension of tradition versus change, we could alleviate some of these tensions so that they're less likely to drive people away.
So how would we do that?
Get really centered on Christ, right? And it's not teddy bear Jesus. It's not be nice. It's the doctrines of Christ. So let me give you an example. The teaching culture that we have in the church is informational, right? If you think about how we teach, we stand up in the front of a classroom and we talk. And lately we've gotten better about having discussion. But what we still do is we convey information, and then we want to impart that into people's minds, and then we want them to accept it, right? So that's culture. Now, a more battle-tested version of that would be to talk less and invite more. So if I was raising my family again, and by the way, when I teach young people, I don't say things like, well, here's the restoration. I know it's true. I say, here are the doctrines of the restoration. Let's talk some of them specifically. And then my invitation is for you to put them into action in your life, right? And so with our missionaries, we would talk faith. It's so funny because missionaries, I said, do you know what faith is? And they'd say, I know what faith is. It's in believing things you can't see. And I say, no, it's not. Okay. It's going forward when you don't know, right? In the face of opposition, in the face of uncertainty, because you trust God's providence, you go forward anyway. And they would go, oh, I never thought of that. I said, why don't you try that? So when you run into problems this week in your area, when you get discouraged, when you face opposition, step back, take a breath, but remember that you can trust God and go forward anyway. And then they would write me in their next letter, President Strong, I tried that. Wow, it worked, right? So less abstraction, more application, more rooted in the doctrines of the gospel.
This is where I think I see a void.
Okay.
In going right along with what you're saying as far as just regurgitating information.
Yeah.
To me, agency is supreme.
Me too.
And you've got to offer an opportunity for agency.
Yes.
And that is the best teacher, for sure. So if I say, if I'm talking to one of my kids or anybody else, and I'm trying to talk about, let's say, exaltation.
Yeah.
I say, look, this is what exaltation is. This is how it's obtained, and this is how it fits into the plan of salvation. And I can go through a judgment, the commandments, mercy, the atonement, how this is overcome, and how I can use this in order for this. Now, so what? Why does that matter? What is the point? Right? But if I can say, here's my experience in trying these things out, as you said, and here's the fruits of these things that I can show you and that you've seen, if you know me, right? And this is what has worked. And here's the fruits of things that sometimes don't work. And I can show you some of those also, both from personal experience and from friends and others that don't work very well. And here's how I think this should be done.
Yeah.
Maybe you should try this, or maybe you don't want to. And that's okay. You can make your own choice on what you want to do here. But here's why I think this is really important and worth it.
Yeah. But you've got to figure this out for yourself. There's an old saying that wisdom can't be taught, it can only be caught. Mm-hmm. So on agency, I'll tell you a short story that I think you'll enjoy that's not in the book, right? So missionaries come, every 6 weeks you get 15 or 20, and they come in all shapes, sizes, and levels of preparedness. But one sister missionary, day 2, she's there 2 days, and she's sitting in my office sobbing, and she wants to go home, right? And that wasn't terribly rare. And this was later in my mission, so I was pretty well equipped to handle it. And I just started to talk to her. Hey, tell me what you're feeling. What's on your mind? What do you want to do? What feels right to you? And the bottom line in that first conversation was she just essentially said, I don't think I really chose this, right? I don't think I chose this. And I said, what do you mean by that? She said, I was just under so much pressure from my parents and my bishop to serve that I went along with it. And then all of a sudden I got here and I realized this wasn't my choice, right? And so I was experienced at that point, and I said, okay, I'm not going to use her name, but I'll just call her Sister B. I said, Sister B, how would you feel about staying 6 weeks just to make sure that you don't make a rash decision? And she said, I think I can do that. And I said, now, let me give you some options. One is at the end of 6 weeks, you just go home. You end your mission and go home, and that's okay. You can do that. I can? Yes, you can. You can choose that. Okay. You're an adult, by the way. You're 21 years old, and this is your choice. I said, number 2, you could transfer to a service mission, right? Where you'd live at home. You'd still serve a mission. You'd wear a tag. You'd do some really amazing, awesome work. And she totally sparked to that. It was like, wow, I could do that. That would be amazing. And then I said, number 3, at the end of the 6 weeks, you might stay. You might decide you want to stay. So she said, I feel really good about that. I said, okay, great. I said, go back to work. And I said, just do one thing, do your best, work hard, throw yourself in so you really know. And then I call her parents to kind of fill them in. Okay, she's in a crisis. She's probably coming home, but I've gotten her comfortable with staying 6 weeks. And then I laid out for them the options, come home, stay, service mission. Her parents were super uncomfortable with the service mission option. And I tried to help them. I tried to say these are legitimate missions. I'm a big fan myself of these because we did a lot of service in our mission. And I said, please be open-minded about that. It could really be a great way for her to serve. And I sort of thought I had them in a good place. And this was on a Sunday. Well, she called home on P-Day on Monday. And Monday night, she's in my office again and she's sobbing. And she says, my parents said I can't serve a service mission. And my dad said, serving a service mission would be the JV team. Okay. So I called her state president and I say, let me tell you what I think's going on. I think they put so much pressure on her to serve that she never made the choice to serve. And so Doctrine and Covenants section 4 says, if ye have desires to serve God, ye are called. Well, she never had a chance to have desires because somebody imposed a plan on her. So the stake president and I agreed. He prevailed with the parents. And what we asked them is just please back off, give her space. let her choose. And that doesn't mean begrudgingly. You can't say, okay, sweetie, it's okay if you come home, but we'll be so disappointed if you do, you know. And so they did. They backed off and they told her, you know what? It's your choice, and whatever you decide, we'll love you. So 6 weeks goes by. She comes into my office, and I'm like really excited to see what she's going to do. And she says, I love it. I'm going to stay. Okay. And I think what happened is when she was given space to choose for herself, she examined, who am I? What do I really want? What kind of person and church member do I want to be? What kind of disciple of Christ do I want to be? And that opened her up for the Spirit to soften her heart, teach her, lead her on a journey over 6 weeks. And she decided, this is exactly what I want to do. And she stayed and she finished her mission, and she was fantastic, right? But agency requires that you be allowed to choose. You know, if there's only chocolate and not chocolate and vanilla, there is no agency, right?
Well, it's with all of it, right? And that's getting back to the preemptive teaching and relating more than just information. It's a matter of, do you give enough awareness and information to give someone a choice?
Yeah. Yes.
Or are you just regurgitating and towing the line?
Yeah. And so one of the things we do, which I think you're poking at, is sometimes we care more about compliance than understanding.
Sure.
So we give them enough to comply, but not enough to understand. And then, Greg, the other thing that I saw is that we sometimes give them a caricature of the gospel, not the gospel. So can I give you an example of that played out? It's a really good one. It's not super common, but it's so instructive. So there's a cultural pattern that we have in the church to make promises that don't come from God. So an example of that is, this is the caricature. We had parents and bishops tell our missionaries, if you're worthy and you serve with all your might, mind, and strength, the Lord will protect your family while you're away. It's not true. It's not a promise that comes from God. That's a check that nobody should be writing because they can't cash it, right? And so we had 5 or 6 instances where a missionary was told that promise. It was a factor in their decision to serve. And then they suffered terrible tragedy at home when they were serving. And so the first one that happened was an amazing, phenomenal sister from Payson, Utah. And she reached out to my wife because she was looking for something more soft, right? And she started the conversation by saying, what in the world did I do wrong? And Sarah says, what are you talking about? And she said, I just got a call from my parents. My brother is dead. He was killed in a car accident. And they promised me that if I serve faithfully, the Lord would protect my family. So that's a caricature that isn't true. It's not the gospel. The gospel is veil of tears, being chosen in the refiner's fire, right? Pick up your cross and follow me. And she was given the caricature, which failed her. And so we had to unwind that. And I'm telling you, my wife, it happened 5 or 6 times. Another was a missionary whose niece drowned in a pool in Arizona while he was serving. And my wife developed just this phenomenal way to unwind that idea in their head and then wind them back into the gospel and help them, without disparaging the people that made the promise, right? But just help them understand the gospel's even better than that, right? The gospel is what's going to get you through those terrible times when nothing else will.
Yeah.
But there's no guaranteed protection.
Yeah, cultural versus doctrinal and information. Yeah, so follow through with me though on the tension versus change.
Yeah.
What is change?
Yeah.
What does that really mean? I mean, you're saying the world's changed.
Yeah, the world's changed.
And we can say church members' lives have changed.
Mm-hmm.
So how is that relative to the gospel? How is that relative to how we manage things or policy?
Let me try and see if this flies or not with you. But if I think back to, since church history is the most common reason people in our survey cited for leaving, there's a whole lot of new complexity in church history that wasn't part of the LDS community 25 years ago, right? And so that's creating tension because people are saying, well, look, this narrative is not what I was taught. That's tension. And so I need a new way to think about what I've been traditionally taught in the context of this new information. So traditionally we had this narrative, but now there's this narrative. I feel tension. How do I resolve that tension? Right. And so the idea that, I've read Rough Stone Rolling 3 times. Somebody said, don't read it, it'll destroy your faith, right? It didn't. It increased my faith.
Yeah, me too.
And I had a chance to have lunch with a group at BYU with Richard Bushman. We got to ask him some great questions. But what I learned from Rough Stone Rolling is that the restoration was this meandering. I believe it was inspired and led by God, but it was meandering, right? And Joseph was a complex guy who I think God used to do his work, but he wasn't perfect, right? So that when I closed the cover the 3rd time, I just said, that gives me hope because I think of my own life and how meandering it's been. And I think of my own imperfections and how significant they are. And if God could do something divine through Joseph Smith, maybe he could use me too, right? So that was a way of resolving tension, right? That was the result of me getting new information. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So in regard to church history, I don't think it doesn't work and it's not going to work. But if we continue to have part of our culture that insists on the historical narrative when people are encountering all this new information, that's mismanaging the tension between tradition and change, right? An interesting parable for me is the parable of the wine bottles. So the Pharisees were criticizing Christ and his disciples because they weren't fasting when they were supposed to be. And he essentially says to them, the law is important, but I'm doing something that's bigger. And then he said, you can't put new wine in old bottles or the bottles will burst and the wine is lost. You have to put new wine in new bottles, right? He was talking about the same thing, right? And then he says, the zinger was, he said, and everybody always prefers the old wine. Right. So I think as we look forward, whether it's church history or social issues, people are receiving large doses of new wine in our contemporary society. Some of that is just fact-based like church history. Some of it is cultural like secularization and those things. We have to give people help, encouragement to form new faithful bottles to handle this new wine. And I don't think that's doctrinal. I think it's mostly cultural, right? And so...
what do you mean it's not doctrinal?
Meaning I don't think the doctrines need to change.
The change is not...
The change is not doctrinal. But Greg, that let's just take doctrine. I would acknowledge that sexual identity, doctrine, and culture, that's so complicated. I think that's probably an outlier in its degree of difficulty. I would put that out there as like super complicated. The tension is greatest there and the gap is widest, right? Between doctrine and culture, contemporary culture. So with that qualifier, I'd say many of the other things that are leading people out of the church, I think can be solved with new faithful bottles that are primarily cultural. Right. So let's not give people a caricature of the gospel. Let's give them the real stuff. And culture, as a businessman, you might have heard Peter Drucker's statement, culture eats strategy for lunch. I think culture eats doctrine for lunch. It eats policy for lunch. But it's not because it's more important, but culture determines how doctrine and policy are thought of, taught, implemented, and ultimately experienced, right? So you can have the same doctrine that doesn't change, and you can run it through a different cultural frame, and the outcomes are going to be profoundly different.
Yes, and I would say that at the far end of that, the doctrine ends up changing anyway. But I think that's.
Tell me what you mean by that so I can understand.
Well, I'm just looking at the apostasy.
Yeah.
Right? You look at the apostasy and you have the philosophies of men. You've got a lot of Neoplatonism and other things that are really starting to enter the church. And so. And
you're saying at some point change the doctrine.
That does change the doctrine, right? Those doctrines do change and the philosophies become more held up and, hopefully that doesn't happen with us.
Yeah.
But I do think that is happening to some degree.
Yeah, no, I think it is. It's interesting to me, blacks and the priesthood and temple privilege is an interesting one to me because I think we would say that was doctrine in 1858, right? I mean, would you say that's doctrine? I mean, some people think it was just a practice or a policy and not a doctrine. I'm not sure I want to wrestle with the semantics. But
Well, what would the doctrine be?
it's hard. I don't know, because Joseph Smith ordained blacks to the priesthood and let
Right.
them go to the temple.
Right. So that's what I'm saying. I'm not sure it's doctrinal.
Yeah.
That's what I'm trying to say, I guess.
I'm with you.
I don't know that it was doctrinal.
I'm with you on that. And so maybe it's not a good example, but whatever it was, it changed.
Mm-hmm.
And part of the reason it changed is societal pressures got greater.
Mm-hmm.
Right now, I read Matthew Harris's book on this, and it's fascinating, by the way. Matt's a very bright guy, and he did great work. He writes mostly through a faithful lens, and so he talks about the important role that revelation played in that process, but he also talks about the role that the prevailing society played. Now, that's a case where the society was going in probably a good direction, and the church moved at the same time, or slightly slower, but at the same time, roughly. I think you're more concerned about places where society's going in the wrong direction.
Yes.
Yeah. What's an example that concerns you?
Family.
Yeah.
The idea of family, I see that being pulled in so many different directions. There are so many movements that are what I would call anti-family.
Yeah.
I do think there's an ideal in that situation. We don't all have it. I didn't have it growing up.
Yeah.
My parents divorced when I was 6 years old.
I had it, but it was very messy.
Yeah, it's like no one rarely has the ideal. I mean, even if you're in that mother or father, and you've got the kids, and you're in the gospel living, and it's no one ends up totally with the ideal.
Yeah.
But whether I'm looking at abortion, whether I'm looking at movements that are misogynistic on one end and toxic on one end, and others that are a girl boss type of,
So you've got extremes.
You've got so many extremes out here that are pulling away from that idea. There was a study that was done at BYU recently that was, it was a few years back, but it was talking about it, just the way it was interpreted was, well, we didn't really used to have traditional families. Leave It to Beaver is this idea of the 20th century. But before that, you had different generations living in the same home, and it's like, yes, but the ideal is not the living situation.
No,
right? And that's the way it got construed and pushed. Is like, there's really not an ideal, and it's like, no, there is an ideal. It is a mom and a dad married and moving toward Christ.
Yeah.
And doing everything they need to do to raise a family and to raise their kids. I don't care what this living situation is. I think it's actually great if you've got other generations that are around.
I'm a big fan of that, by the way.
Yeah.
The multi-generational household.
It's the way most of history is gone. So, but just, I would say that's a one place that I'm very concerned with.
That's a good one. Here's what I'd say. So maybe using the construct of, is it doctrine, is it culture, and how would the culture affect that? I'm just a fellow traveler here sharing an opinion. So I don't know that I have any brilliant insight, but I deeply believe in the power and value of traditional families, right? So that as a doctrine of the church, I hope that doesn't change, right? So if it does, I would be concerned about that. So I wouldn't say, hey, the tension between tradition and change should be alleviated there with the doctrinal change. But I would say, given that there are many members of the church that don't fit that profile, culturally, can we do more to embrace and support them?
Yes.
Right. That's it.
Sure.
Yeah, that's it. And so I know in our study, for example, we asked people to, this wasn't rating themselves. The question was, how valued do you think certain people would feel in the church? And then we gave them a list of different types of people. And so, for example, someone who's divorced, they said, yeah, they'll feel significantly less valued in the church, right? So on a 5-point scale, like your son or daughter just went through the temple and got married, 4.5, right? Your son or daughter just came from home from a successful mission, 4.5. You're single, lower. You're divorced, much lower. You have an LGBTQ family member, lower still. You didn't serve a full-time mission at all, low, right? Those are cultural to me. They're not doctrinal. Yes. Yeah. So I'm not, when I stopped doing the work I was doing for the church and went on a mission, for the most part, in general, as I was thinking about the question, in order to retain more members, do we need to change doctrine? The answer I came to after 2.5 years of talking to people was no. But sometimes we don't actually live our doctrines, and the culture makes those doctrines problematic because we're not living them, right? And so it was much more about, nope, the doctrines are generally fine, and what we need to do is we actually need to live them, and we need to make sure that culture is not making them something they're not, caricatures, right? Yeah. So the family one to me is a really good example.
So a family, let's say, recently just had one of their members, a child, a grown adult maybe, leave the church.
Yep.
The parents are wondering what is going on. How did this happen? Probably thinking, what did I do wrong?
Mm-hmm. That's certainly where we went.
Where do I do wrong? What could I have done?
Yeah.
If the motivation for the child leaving the church, or the child, let's say, but the adult son or daughter has left the church. If the motivation is for faith claims, let's say it's faith claims, and they have just a different perspective, something's broken in what they used to have as their framework for belief.
Yeah.
From a parent's perspective, and then from the person leaving the church's perspective, help walk through the scenario on how should be handled.
How to handle that. Yeah, that's such a good question. I might want to contrast how not to and how to, because it's helpful. Joseph Grenny and I did a little thing on this as part of our research, but I'd probably start with an umbrella of part of the goal should be not to mischaracterize one another, right? So here's what happens today. Often people who, when someone leaves, our natural tendency is to mischaracterize why they left, right? It's just kind of human nature, and we tend to do that. And so the tropes that you hear is, they sinned and lost the spirit. They were led away by the philosophies of men. And those things are true sometimes, but sometimes it's something much simpler and more pure than that, right? It might be their testimony was based on the restoration narrative, and they encountered information that was disruptive to that. And they feel sort of a sense of integrity that I can't keep believing this when I now have new information that suggests what I believed was not accurate, right? And they may not have this other lever that I had, which is, well, my testimony wasn't really based in that in the first place. And so we got to be careful not to mischaracterize people who leave. And also people who leave need to be really careful not to mischaracterize people who stay. So I had a chat with a woman last week that called me after seeing a podcast and wanted to chat. And she has 5 children, 3 have left. Her youngest child just left, and the child sent her a letter saying, I'm leaving the church, and gave her an ultimatum saying, if you don't lead the church, I won't have any contact with you. So you think about the presumption that's involved in that. And this woman is a really normal, faithful, good, salt of the earth Latter-day Saint. She's not naive about any of the reasons her child cited for leaving, but her faith is rooted in something else. And so I think somebody that's leaving needs to allow some accommodation for people who stay aren't idiots, right? And so, my brother did that eventually for me once we had a conversation, and he said, okay, I now understand why you have stayed.
Well, there's a tendency, you've got both sides have got to steel man their position.
That's exactly right. And by the way, you're always, well, not always, but human nature is to steel man it in a way that validates you, right? So when Joseph and I did the research, he's I don't know if you know much about Joseph, but he's the guy that founded the Other Side Academy in Salt Lake, which gets early release prison felons and then helps them reassimilate. So it's God's work for sure. But he also wrote 2 best-selling books on how to have high-stakes conversations. So he called me and said, hey, let's do some research.
Crucial conversation.
Yeah, that's it. And so he said, let's do some research on faith transition conversations, see what we can learn. So we did. And so he would, if he were here, he'd say, okay, number 1 is take a breath, take a breather, right? And so what that means is when these conversations happen, you've got to be in the right frame of mind to make sure that they're healthy and productive. And if you're not in the right frame of mind, don't do it. Right? So step back, take a breath, and get yourself in the right place. Now, what Joseph would say, he's really a good communicator. He said, we don't operate vehicles or heavy equipment under the influence. You should never have one of these conversations under the influence either. The influence of your fear, your anxiety, the stories you're telling yourself that aren't true. So take a breather. Don't talk under the influence. Second, he would say, okay, you got to get yourself right first. Now, it doesn't matter which side you're on, right? The lever or the stayer. Really, really examine your motives. What is it that you really want? What is it that you really think? What story are you telling yourself that may or may not be true, but might really make this conversation problematic, right? And you got to get that stuff out of your head because it will prevent a healthy, productive conversation. And then number 3, have the right end in mind, which is not correction and containment. In other words, it's not getting the other person to agree with you. It's connecting and preserving the relationship so the conversation
is really hard.
It is hard.
I mean, and you're in a church environment, or a church family, and it's like, well, this is the path. This is the covenant path.
Yeah.
I've got to bring you back onto it.
Yeah.
That's hard. A very difficult.
It is.
What is it? It's a release.
You want it really bad.
Well, you want it really bad. You believe you're right.
Yes.
This is the truth.
Yeah.
So there is kind of
it's very understandable that we would react that way.
Yeah, it's very understandable. It's almost though a change of values to get to where you need to go.
Tell me what you mean by values. Because I would have maybe used the word mindset, but maybe it's tell me what.
Well, what am I valuing most in this case where I have to fix this person?
Yeah.
Right. It's this person has to be on the covenant path now or else. And that's what I value the most. And my family's ripped apart.
Yes.
What happens to my eternal family? What happens to the well-being of my, the person leaving?
Absolutely.
That's what you're valuing the most.
Yeah. And so let me go back to the parable of the wine bottle. So the new wine is you've got a child that stepped away. Mm-hmm. Okay. The old bottle is all of those things that you just talked about. It isn't going to work. So one reason you should consider a different approach is it's dead on arrival.
No.
Okay. It's just not going to happen. Now I'll contrast 2 examples. My experience, my wife and I with our son, and then a really good friend of mine with his son, both young men left their missions. So first of all, we did not have the self-awareness to not talk under the influence. Okay. So the minute I got the email from my son, I fired one back. Right. And if I still have it, it's full of love and kindness, but I was clearly the patronizing, wise father straightening my son out and telling him what he needed to know. So that was what I did. And what my friend and his wife did is they called the Strongs, first of all. They said, okay, he was a counselor for me when I was a bishop. And so he watched my family go through this. And he said, I know that you learned so much. So can we come over and just hear what you learned? And so that was the moment where they took a breath and weren't talking under the influence. Right. And so we gave them some of these principles, and they had a week before they picked their son up at the airport. So they got themselves in the right place. Right. Mm-hmm. Now, here's what was really powerful. Greg, I was running those tapes that you talked about a minute. That was in my head. In fact, I flew to California where he was in school. I'll bet over the first couple of years, 20 times. Mm-hmm. And almost every one of those was a mission to fix him, mm-hmm. right? Where I was going to explain to him why what he was doing was the wrong choice. And so that I still hadn't gotten free of that. My friend, on the other hand, really examined why he was really angry like we were, right? So he said to himself, why am I so angry? Like this really, he said, I just want to choke him, And he's talked publicly about this, so I can share it. He would be happy to have me share it. But he said, Jeff, I just got very deeply humble and prayerful, and I started to pray for guidance. And here's his first prayer that he uttered. How can I turn my son to repentance? And the Spirit said, what are you talking about? This isn't about that. This is about you. You know, your problem is you, right? His problem is between he and I, not between you and he and I, right? And so the next place he went was reflecting on, and this was a prayerful, thoughtful, spirit-led kind of self-reflection, but why am I so angry? And Greg, he got really honest with himself. He said, I want the validation. I want to be that father. All my kids serve missions. All my kids marry in the temple. The celestial dining room table is full. And I want that for me. And I want the validation that comes with that. I want to be that guy. And the Spirit said, not happening and not important. You're confused about what matters here. This is about your son's relationship with me. It is not about your validation. Now, what's interesting, I had many conversations with parents when their missionaries were coming home early or got sent home. There's a massive validation component. I talked to one woman, well, as a mother, father for probably 2 hours, and she kept saying, well, what about me? Don't my feelings matter? And I very diplomatically said, they don't. You know, you're great people. I'm so sorry that you're feeling pain, but your feelings are not a factor here, right? And so we need that. We rely on that validation. And then the most powerful part is my friend. So he wasn't going into this. He got really clear on how he needed to think about it. This is about my son and his relationship with God. And my job is to stay out of the way and love him and just reflect Christ's light to him. But it's not my job to fix him. That's not my job.
How does that change hope? Or does it?
For me, it increases hope, right? Because you turn it over to God instead of relying on yourself. So there's a massive increase when you say, God, you often use the word trust when talking about faith. That's what we're talking about here. I trust God more than I trust my ability to fix my child, right? And then because he got his head in the right place, we didn't. I was still trying to correct and contain. He then could actually honestly and authentically approach the conversation and the ongoing relationship from the perspective of love, support, connection, help, but not control, right? Now, the most powerful part to me was he said, Jeff, like you were talking about those feelings that we have inside where I want that for my family. I believe in this. I believe it's right. My child is off track. I got to fix this because I'm a problem solver, right? Mm-hmm. And he said, those feelings were so strong in me, I could not suppress them. Even after I had been through all these really deeply spiritual experiences. And he said, I felt inspired to go to my son and say, look, I'm in a pretty good place. But I got to tell you, for 40 years, the culture has conditioned me to think this way, and it's not going to unwind itself overnight. And you're going to feel it ooze out of me sometimes, and it's going to feel negative and bad. And he just said, please be patient with me. And I said, how's it going? And he teared up and he said, he's been so patient, right? And I said, how's he doing? Great. Comes home every week for dinner. We talk about the church and gospel. He's still very active. He's just trying to figure things out, right? So we can't control the outcomes. We can have more. If I was to give anybody, what did I learn from my own journey with my own kids? Don't teach a caricature of the gospel, teach the gospel. Respect their agency, trust them, trust God, and recognize that this might be a meandering journey. You know, Adam and Eve got kicked out of the garden, right? And she says to Adam when they're leaving the garden, it's better that we pass through sorrow that we might learn. I was in the temple once. My daughter was getting married. My son couldn't be there. And I'm sad, like super sad. And at that very moment in the endowment, the Spirit just said, he's learning. Let him learn. Mm-hmm. Okay. So are we going to trust God, or are we going to trust our imperfect, abstract understanding of eternal doctrine? Mm-hmm. Right? That's a new wine bottle, right? So there was a point when I said, okay, I believe those doctrines, but I'm going to put more trust in God than in my understanding of how those doctrines play out through the eternities. Yeah. New bottle.
Yeah. And that changes everything.
It does.
I mean, that lowers your pain.
Big time.
And increases your hope.
Yes.
And I think your understanding, again, when you make agency supreme, and understand that we all have to choose for ourselves,
You have to choose for yourself.
then it becomes opportunity. Right?
I had a really powerful experience that it also is not in the book, but for 3 years, it's accurate to say that my wife and I wallowed in darkness and despair, right? And it's because we didn't know how to do anything different, right? And that just landed on us like a tidal wave, and we were drowning in it. And one of the things that saved me is I was a bishop at the time. So I would mope through the week, Monday through Saturday, worried about my problems, worried about my son, worried about all the things we worry about. And then I'd go to church on Sunday, and I would have 12 hours at the chapel where I forgot about every problem I had and just focused on everyone else. And I would come home on Sunday night on cloud nine, right? Because I turned outward, I lost myself, forgot about my problems, and God would help me understand, you're going to be okay, right? But it was a 3-year kind of thing. And then like we do when we're in pain, I was searching for answers. I was praying. I was putting his name on the prayer roll at the temple. I was reading my scriptures, and I read 2 Nephi 31, which is my favorite scripture now, right? So you might recall that Nephi's at the end of his life, and he says, look, I've been writing a lot, right? And you get the impression it was tiring, right? He's an old man now. And then he says, but I've got to talk about, there's just one more thing I have to talk about. The doctrine of Christ, right? And then he gives the list. And then the last half of the chapter, he talks about the mindset, the heart that you need to have as you live the doctrine. And he says things like unshaken faith in him who is mighty to save, a perfect brightness of hope, a love of God and of all men. And then he says, this is the doctrine of Christ. This is the only true doctrine of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. And I read those pages, and what's through my head, Greg, is how do I have unshaken faith and a perfect brightness of hope? I feel terrible. I feel like this giant cloud has crushed my family. And how do I do that? And the Spirit was said to me, you just choose. Just choose. It's a choice. Now, what's interesting about that to me is if you don't know you have a choice, you cannot exercise agency, right? And I went, it's a choice? Yes, Jeff, it's a choice.
It's a choice.
And then once I understood that, I exercised my agency, and I said, I choose faith. I choose hope. I walk down to the other end of the house, and I walk into, Sarah's got like this craft laundry room. I stumble in there and I just say, I'm done. And she doesn't know what I'm talking about, right? And I say, yeah, I'm done. I'm done being afraid. I've gotten my PhD on fear for 3 years. It takes me nowhere except to dead ends and black holes. And I'm done. I'm going to trust God, and I'm going to believe in my son, right? Now, what's fascinating to me is my life changed at that moment, but Cale told me something later. He said, I felt it. And he said, you were always my biggest cheerleader. And when I felt frustration, despair, hopelessness from you, my cheerleader, I thought I was not in a terrible place, right? I'm a young man and I'm going through a journey, but I didn't feel like I was a lost cause. But when I felt those emotions from you, I thought, okay, if the man that loves me more than any man, that knows me better than any person, feels hopelessness towards me, maybe I am a lost cause, right? But when my hope returned, he also felt that. He literally said, I felt the wind come back into my sails, right? And so, Greg, I think that's the power we have on people around us. And that's why a perfect love casteth out all fear. That's why the scriptures say more than 100 times, fear not. That's why the first principle of the gospel is faith in Jesus Christ. It's just the antidote to so many problems that we create for ourselves because we don't have enough faith.
Yeah. Did you have anything in the research that you did based on gender?
Be a little bit more specific.
So are there different reasons for women leaving the church? The different reasons for men leaving the church? There are, for example, right now, a lot more young women leaving the church than there are young men. In fact, young men actually has a little bit of an uptick.
They do.
And for the first time, maybe ever, as far as it's been recorded, you have throughout Christianity, as many men in the pews as you do women.
You do. That's all accurate. So the answer is sort of. So let me be precise. We have all the data that would allow us to cross-tab by gender and look at it, and by age. We haven't done it yet. Yeah, it's just the data set's massive, and we've been, consumed with just getting a basic report out and writing a book. But I can tell you anecdotally, okay, because I've interviewed so many people. So this isn't generalizable, but men most often are, at a higher rate, men leave over church history issues. Okay. And at a higher rate, women leave over social issues.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. And it's pretty clear to me that that's the pattern.
So the social issues are becoming a bigger issue then.
They are. In fact, we call them waves in the book. Wave 1 is lifestyle. It's been around forever, right? Wave 2 is church history. 2005 to 10, it sort of crashed on the beach. Wave 3 social issues, probably 2015-ish. So back in 2013, when the church did the gospel topic essays, I don't remember anybody talking about LGBTQ stuff, right? Equal rights has been out there for a long time. So I think the social issue piece has crashed on the beach harder since 2015. And then the fourth bucket, church experience, to me is a little bit more contemporary. And I can't prove that with the data. It's just based on my own observations. But yeah, I think 10 years from now, bucket 3, social issues, might be the biggest bucket. I think people are starting to process and acclimate to some of the historical issues. They're coming up with a new bottle for that old wine.
Yeah.
Or excuse me, a new bottle for their new wood.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It would be very interesting to me to take the data you have and expand and compare with Christianity more broadly in the U.S.
Yeah.
And see what is happening. Again, we've got reasons here, but they're, not all of them, but there's very internal issues that are simply specific to us as Latter-day Saints.
Yeah.
But the numbers are similar across the board.
In fact, it'll be interesting to see if the broader Christian community takes an interest in this. I did an interview for a Christian radio program last week. It was fabulous, by the way. And most of my Christian non-Latter-day Saint friends think that the issues are very, very similar. Relative disaffiliation, our church versus others. You already cited that we retain more people than most other denominations. That's correct based on the data I've seen. Whether the trend is worse for us than others is under debate. So there are many people that say nobody says we're better in trend. We're the same at best. Some people think we're slightly worse. The data, we don't have a conclusive answer to that yet. But I agree with your premise that a lot of this is just institutional religious stuff.
Yeah, and there's sometimes people will say things like, critical of the church in some degree, both faithful members and non-faithful members, and are kind of like, well, if there weren't, for the most part, 15 white men at the top of the church, and I'm thinking, okay, well, that's here, but why is this happening over here and over here and over here?
Yeah, because they're very.
And I had a bad experience with my bishop or something, and say, well, what about over here and over here and over here?
Yeah.
And we need a policy change because look at this. And I'm like, well, what about over here and over here? You know what I'm saying? It's like this is a very broad problem.
It is. Yeah, it is. The thing that I'll agree with that, and the thing that would cause me to add a perspective to that is, I take almost no comfort in we're the same as everyone else.
Oh, definitely not.
Like I don't. And it's funny because we talk numbers a lot, but the most important number is what's happening in your family with your loved ones. So I interviewed a woman from Southern Utah, 8 children, 7 of her 8 are out. So if you have a conversation with her about comparative disaffiliation, it's dead on arrival. She just says, I don't care. And I don't care that we're baptizing people in West Africa either. 7 of my kids left, right? And so there's a human component here that runs through the numbers that's important. I don't know if you've ever read this talk by Elder Lynn G. Robbins. It's called 100% Responsible. Oh. You'd love it. You'd love it. Look it up. I'll send it to you if you can't find it. I'll just send it to you. But my first mission president seminar, which was like 4 months in, Your head is spinning because you're trying to figure out, how do I run the mission? And it's human complexity you're dealing with. It's not management complexity. And so I go to my first seminar, and this is like a gold mine. All these mission presidents that have been out 2 or 3 years, or nearly 3 years, and I want to pick their brains. So the first question I asked is, what's the single best talk that you use to teach your missionaries valuable life lessons for their missions? The answer I got 9 out of 10 times was Lynn Robbins, 100% responsible. Yeah, the basic message in the talk is, it does not matter. At the end of the day, the buck stops with you. And so he gives some examples from his professional background where they were having some production problems and customer service problems, and the organization didn't understand the principle of responsibility. And so he had to teach them that, look, it doesn't matter if this is late or that is late or this is up or that is down. At the end of the day, your job is to move the peanut one step forward on time. And so he then translates that into being a missionary. And it's, if you believe in personal responsibility, being an agent, not an object, it's such a good talk, right? Yeah. So when I look at what's happening in our church, I say, okay, well, we are having success. We are baptizing. We're retaining at a higher level, and we're losing too many. And regardless of what's happening anywhere else, I want to be a positive outlier, right? I want to be the church where everybody says, those guys, in the face of secular challenges, in the face of all the swirl that goes on around institutional religion, these guys have rooted themselves so deeply in the powerful doctrines of Christ that they seem to be impervious to this stuff. To me, that would be Zion.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's I know it's a high bar, it's a super high bar, but that's my hope.
Jeff, all your research, the book, compiling this, what is the best thing that you have learned going through all of this?
Yeah. Wow, such a good question. I'll give you a couple of insights, but then maybe something that happened inside me as I went through the process. And I'm going to be pretty transparent about that. Probably the most powerful thing I learned about disaffiliation is how deeply sincere and thoughtful people are when they step away. So one of the misconceptions is that, people do it flippantly, or maybe they're lazy. There's nothing in our research or my interviews with people that suggests that's true. I would almost compare it to the death of a loved one, right? It's that kind of serious, emotional, spiritual investment. And Greg, the bias they have is almost always to stay. It's like overpowering bias to stay. And it takes on it, the data's a little fuzzy on this, but it looks like about 10 years is how long people wrestle with this until at some point they just say, look, it's better that I step away than stay. So that was probably the biggest surprise. So what I felt, empathy, compassion, understanding, a desire to connect with people, to validate them as human beings, to let them know that I see them, right? The thing that happened inside me is, I hope you can relate to this and that it makes sense to you, but when you spend as much time as I've spent talking to people who have left the church, right? And then I worked for the church for a while, and then I was a mission president, and I'm seeing these cultural problems in our missionaries, right? And I started to get frustrated and a little bit angry, like, why are we doing this? Why can't we fix this? Now, that's coming from a place where 3 of my 5 children stepped away. So I'm feeling a little personally singed by that, right? Like, my kids are gone because of some of these issues. Let's get her fixed now, right? So I was a little bit frustrated. My editors would tell you the first couple of drafts of the book, they just said, Jeff, dude, put the flamethrower away. Joseph Grenny took me to lunch and said, he read it, and he said, you can't do this with pitchforks and torches. And he said, you need to rewrite the book. So I did. Now, what's been fun is, as I've engaged with the Latter-day Saint community, people like you, it massively restored my faith and confidence in us as a people. Because I realized we just have a great community. We have amazing people in our community. Many, many people understand these issues and have the right, in my opinion, the right mindset, humility, compassion. Let's learn, let's grow, let's understand, let's go to work on this. And it just made me hopeful. Hey, I think we got this, right? Now, can we overwhelm what's happening in society? Maybe not, but can we be a positive outlier? I think we can. So the overwhelming sentiment, I had a friend come to my house today. He's a cabinet maker. We served in a young men's presidency in Midway. And he just came up to me and hugged me, right? And he's a very, very traditional, super Orthodox guy. And he just said, Jeff, I just read the book. Thank you. I love you. We can do this, right? And there are people coming out of the woodwork, and many of them are the most Orthodox and traditional Latter-day Saints. The people that are in leadership, the people that have a greater influence on the culture. That filled me with hope.
Yeah, great. Okay, grab the book here.
Yeah, sure.
Book is Torn: Why People We Love Leave the Church and What We Can Learn from Them. Jeff Strong, great book. Go grab it. We'll put the link in the description box.
Yeah, thank you.
And I appreciate our conversation. It's been great, very productive.
It's such a pleasure to be with you. Thank you.